Welcome to nRhythm's Design Sprints. Really, design sprints are all about recognizing that many of the issues that we face today are complex in nature, from inequity to climate change to food security to economies. These are all design issues, and at nRhythm, we believe it's time for a redesign. So using nRhythm's regenerative framework as a guide, we talk to leaders across a variety of industries about reimagining the systems that we're a part of and what shifts need to take place in order to truly realize and ignite systems change both locally and globally. So we use nature as inspiration and principles of living systems to talk to leaders across all these industries about how we can reimagine these systems. And today, we're really excited to be focusing on the commons. So my name's Alex, for those of you who I haven't met yet. I'm a member of the team here at nRhythm, joined by Jeff and Jen and Trey and many amazing members of our community here as well. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, nRhythm is a management and design firm, and we focus on revealing potential in people and in organizations. And so today I'm really excited to welcome Jeff Su is going to be leading the conversation. He's going to be leading this design sprint, and we're excited to welcome our guest, David Bollier. So a little bit about David. He'll have the chance to share more about himself in a little bit, but I'll share a little bit about his background and his history. So he is the director of Reinventing the Commons Program at the Schumacher Center for New Economics in Massachusetts in the United States. He's also the co-founder of the Commons Strategies Group, an international advocacy project. He's an editor of or author of 9 books on the commons, including Think Like a Commoner and Free, Fair, and Alive. Prior to his work in the commons, David collaborated with television writer, producer, activist Norman Lear for 25 years and worked with Ralph Nader in the 1970s and early 80s. And he resides in Amherst, next door to Jeff, who is going to be leading the conversation today. And so thank you so much for joining us, David. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Jeff, and I'll stop my screen share as well. And invite everyone who's tuning in, if you just want to put your Zoom on speaker view, it'll give you a great view to be able to see the speakers today. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alex, and welcome everyone. I'm so glad you're here. And yes, I'm such a fan of David's that I moved in 2 doors from him 18 months ago. No, what we're referring to actually the wonderful serendipity and small world of like interests and like aspirations. And so I actually moved back to Amherst, Massachusetts, my hometown, 18 months ago, and kept hearing this name, David Bollier, and I should get in touch, and in many different Zoom contexts. And it so happens that we live 2 doors down from each other, which has been wonderful to get to know each other. So for those of you who are joining us for a design sprint for the first time, welcome. And we're just going to have a really open conversation with David. And towards the end of our hour, we're going to, Trey, who's on our team, is going to do a little sense making of our conversation based upon some of nRhythm's work and some of nRhythm's regenerative framework. So with that, David, your background is really varied and open. What brings you to this work in particular today from that diverse history?
Well, it's actually been a journey that's taken a while. It's been about 20 years since I more seriously decided to focus on the commons. And I guess the backstory would be that I came out of a Washington policy and activist background for 8 or 10 years in the 70s and 80s, working with Ralph Nader and a congressman and a regulatory agency person and a few others. And flashing forward to the late 90s, I started to get disillusioned with the capacity of electoral politics and even law to be, what shall I say, the host for the transformation that needs to happen. And as it happened, I fell in with a number of colleagues who were themselves refugees from Washington politics and wanted to try to reimagine things. And we started to realize that culture, in some ways, in social practice, precedes politics. And by way of framing, I would say this was in the 90s, where It was the Clinton era. It was the dawn of the internet as a mass medium. I guess the web had started in the early 90s, but it was just taking off, and open source software was taking off. And I just started to realize that on the internet, there was lots of activity that was neither state-based nor market-based. That was what I would now call commons-based. And we've seen an explosion of that over the past 20 years as well. And around the same time, I started to discover Eleanor Ostrom, who is an Indiana University political scientist who studied what she was then called common property or common pool resources. She later won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for her work, her field work, and her creative theorizing about the commons. So there was, for me, a convergence of a lot of different things in the late 90s and early 2000s, in which I saw the commons as making more sense as a vehicle for social and political transformation than a lot of the received structures of the system, so-called. And I had a sense, I fell in with some colleagues who shared the same views, but from their own different perspectives, one more economistic minded, one more culturally or spiritually minded, and so forth. And over time, I then discovered a lot of Europeans who I think, well, frankly say are quite a distance ahead of Americans in both politically and intellectually in studying the commons and trying to push it forward. So that in a nutshell was how I got into the commons. It's sort of a longer, complicated story, but a convergence of factors 20 years ago.
Great. And so the word commons is used a lot. We have a town common in our shared town of Amherst. I think there's a strip mall with a Pizza Hut in it with the word commons used on it. So maybe tell us a little bit about what a commons is to you and how you would think of it.
Well, the term I think is really quite ancient, or at least for the West, it's more familiarly associated with English history, where they did have functional commons, where commoners would raise their pigs, collect their wood, gather water, and so forth. And it was a shared resource that they managed themselves, albeit under the power of the feudal lords. But it was a self-organized system. It was later demolished, more or less, with industrial enclosures in which market-oriented players decided, with a collusion of parliament, privatized and commodified the shared wealth. And I think especially with the rise of the internet and the impasse of political culture, a lot of people have seen the merits of resurrecting the term that has a history, albeit in a very different context, but has a history that's instructive today in terms of the dispossession of people and their shared wealth, in terms of the marketization of experience and resources. And so the commons is at once a critique of contemporary market state society, as I call it, as well as a platform for constructing alternatives. So it's not just a critique, but a way that everything from community land trust to wikis and lots of other digital spaces to urban commons, which are especially prevalent in Europe, and many other varieties are happening. In fact, a commons can happen whenever a group of people get together and decide they want to manage a shared resource for their collective good with a certain element of participation and fairness. So really, the commons has a lot of different meanings. I could talk a little bit, if you'd like, about some of those different strands. There's scholarship, there's Marxist approaches, there's resource economistic focuses. All of those, I think, have something to say, but my focus on the commons is really more on the commons as a social system that is organized by a group of people for a distinct shared purpose, of which a resource is a part, but it's not simply managing resources in an efficient way, the way economists might approach it. So those are a few opening thoughts on the commons.
Great, let's follow that. So in how you're thinking about commons as a social system, what is a common purpose a key aspect of a commons coming together, or people using commons?
Well, in the most generic way, I like to put it as a community of people with a shared purpose, a resource, and then a set of rules and protocols and traditions and rituals, sort of the soft stuff, by which they manage the resource. And there's no single blueprint or definition, for the simple fact that commons take a lot of direction from the resource and context they're working from. And so there's no universal grid, there's no essentialist definition for a commons, because part of its effectiveness as a vehicle for managing things and forming community is that if you're in Africa, it will have a different form than if you're in an industrialized circumstance. Or if you're dealing with water, it'll be different from dealing with digital resources. Having said that, there are certain cross-cutting social phenomena of how people get together to manage things. And that was the focus of my recent book with my German activist colleague, Silke Helfrich, The Free, Fair, and Alive, where we, unlike the Eleanor Ostrom approach, which comes from a rational actor economistic school of thought about managing resources, this was more about the social dynamics of peer governance, provisioning, and social life. We created three different interrelated spheres of social life, peer governance, and provisioning, in which there were certain recurrent patterns of how people organize themselves, which they're not necessarily there in all cases, but we found from looking at really dozens or scores of different examples that there are certain patterns. So that was how we came to approach it in a different way, which we think honors the real social and cultural dynamics of a commons, as opposed to approaching it as an economist would, trying to figure out how a resource will be managed as the primary issue.
Great. I'd love to follow up on that a little bit. If you could maybe talk about some of these patterns and principles that emerged from your research, and in particular, I think this framing around free, fair, and in particular alive for a lot of our audiences here, I think is really powerful. And maybe if you could kind of point to that, why free, fair, and alive, and how does that relate to the patterns that you're describing?
Well, I think you can drill down pretty far. I mean, I came to the commons from a policy and a somewhat economic perspective, but the more I got into it, the more I realized that it really cuts very deeply, not only just socially or culturally, but in terms of ontology, meaning our presuppositions about reality and our selfhood. And I think for me, the ultimate point is that it's all relational. Living systems are relational primarily, and not fixed or objects. And therefore, it's less about resources, although of course that's an important part of it, than about our relationality in managing the resources. And so this is part of being alive. And I also take a lot of cues from biology and evolutionary science. I have especially a dissident biologist friend and eco-philosopher, Andreas Weber, who has a rather heterodox approach to biological and ecological phenomena as profoundly relational, that reality itself is relational, and that organisms are not simply, in the neo-Darwinistic story, in this nasty competitive struggle, although of course that happens, but it's profoundly symbiotic and relational as well. And moreover, individuals have a certain creative agency for fulfilling their needs, that even at all levels of life, this happens. And while you can't say that microorganisms have feelings, there is a certain tropism, there is certain agency that they have to survive. But the point of this is that in human life, emotions, morality, spirituality is not just an epiphenomena off to the side. it's part of the evolutionary story as well. There's reasons that we develop that. So once you start to get into this mindset of relationality, which biologists are starting to affirm through biosemiotics, the study of how different organisms interrelate, or there's quite a surge in cultural studies about the so-called new animism, which takes some of the lessons of indigenous peoples and says that their kind of interrelations with the earth and natural systems is instructive for us moderns today who have lost track of that. So these are some themes that I think inform the commons and help reposition it as a social relational phenomena versus simply a transactional phenomena of economic resources.
Great. Yeah, I know you talk about in your work the need to actually shift our ontology, or you coined this term onto shifts. What ontology do we need to shift from, and what do we need to shift to in relation to being free and fair and alive and provisioning and managing these social systems?
Well, my colleague Silke and I, when we were writing this book, we kept unwittingly running up against these barriers of language, which steered us in certain directions about how the world works. And one day here in Amherst, we went to the Amherst College Geology Museum where they have these dinosaurs. And we learned a sort of a lesson by metaphor there, where this president of Amherst College in the 1840s encountered all these sandstone footprints in the Pioneer Valley where we live here. And he was trying to figure out what they were. And this was before Darwin had published. It was before the word dinosaur had been invented. And the best he could come up with as somebody imbued with the biblical creationist mindset was that these were giant birds or turkeys. And he had no way of conceptualizing that something like deep time or something that could give rise to dinosaur footprints or a whole different world of animals. And the lesson we took away from this is that there are certain worldviews that simply prevent, and the language that goes with them, that prevent you from understanding a different perspective. And we realized that this was the case with the commons, where we had seen these dozens of different commons ourselves firsthand. And we came to realize that a lot of the received academic discourse about it was just not ontologically correct. And by that, we mean it wasn't based on like a prisoner's dilemma of individuals locked in their own individual identity who are then rationally trying to figure something out with someone else. It was more of an immersive collective enterprise with lots of communication, lots of shared understandings, that's what animated things. And we realized that we needed to, neither of us are philosophers, but we realized there was an ontological shift that we needed to make to understand, or at least express, the commons the way we had witnessed it. So we talk about the need for an ontological shift, which starts to acknowledge that we're not just individuals that were isolated, atomistic, the way Homo economicus says. We invented a number of terms. One of them was the nested I, that we're nested within these larger circles of culture and social practice. Another was, it's not just me, the individual, and that the resource, the way an economist would be talking. It was about care wealth, where you have an identity and a tradition and culture that's associated with these so-called resources, and therefore you treat them differently from a market player might regard price and inert dead resource. That's how he or she would approach it. In a commons, you don't have that kind of relationship to the object, the way indigenous people have a very different relationship with objects that we would consider dead, really. So we came up with the term onto shift as a way to describe the shift of perspective to understand some of these other dynamics going on in commons. And once you do that, a lot of stuff makes a lot more sense to me. And you are able to escape a lot of the so-called paradoxes or dilemmas, because you're approaching it from a different set of premises.
That's great. And so building upon that, if we if I'm hearing you right, and there's a lot of folks here gathered around the term regenerative, whether it be regenerative development, regenerative organizations, and which in general we often talk about is a shifting from a sort of dominant mechanistic worldview to something that is more aligned with life and in more alive. And so we've talked about an alignment there. What's the power of that in your mind? What's the the greatest state if we were to really reimagine our economies, our education, our societies with these patterns and principles? What emerges from that? What's the promise of that?
Well, I think instead of seeing this as a totally external problem that has to be have further intrusive interventions, that this is almost in some ways a perceptual and internal problem, the register of perception, the register of language we use to describe it. I think once we can approach it in a different way and unlearn some of our other modern Western market approaches of approaching phenomena and see in a different way, that it opens up different solution spaces for all sorts of problems. And we can see that, climate change, for example, it's not as if everything has to be done through the national or international bodies in some diktat which commands these changes. It's going to be something that's working at the cellular level socially and moving on up and having those kind of different resonances. Because, we could argue about climate change, but I think that the existing institutions don't have the trust or efficacy to do what has to be done. And there has to be both a personal change that is then manifested in our social institutions in the ways that we manage things. So regenerative economics would obviously be part of that kind of a conversation. How that proceeds is maybe part of the challenge and drama, because is this going to be another kind of ecological economics where the standard frame of Homo economicus and market exchange is the dominant narrative? Or is it going to be something that has different categories of thought, different types of relationships that are manifesting that maybe don't strictly adhere to the economics 101 approach? So I think that this is, and I say this with some humility because I've had to myself extricate myself from old ways of thinking and assumptions, and it's very difficult, which is one reason of necessity we came up with some words for certain phenomena just as a scaffolding to get out of the old and get a new perspective.
Great.
So I think regenerative economics, I think, is part of that. Maybe you could prod me a bit more about parts of that need attention, or I'm not familiar enough with some of the flashpoints of discussion in the area.
Yeah, I'd love to come back to this view of commons being social systems and relational. And I know that you often in your work refer to the commons as a phenomenon, but also commoning as a process. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, that's again an attempt. Commoning, I didn't invent the term, but it's been percolating around in some of the circles I'm in as a long time, because it's the social practices that are more critical than the noun, which is often misconstrued as the resource, or that it's a thing, when really it's more of an ongoing activity, which has a lot to do with life itself. So in some ways it's misleading to talk about it as a noun. I find it so interesting that so many indigenous cultures have lots of these verb type constructions, as opposed to assuming that something can be defined in a fixed static way or in an abstract way. And so this is a very practical, nitty-gritty human engagement with nature and resource type of conversation. And commoning is essentially about the everyday practices of negotiation, who does what, making sure that somebody doesn't trespass or destroy or vandalize the resource, devising rules for fair allocations of the resource, finding ways to ritualize your togetherness and the social connection in the whole process. And all these different patterns are really, I don't want to say a way of life because that has a certain freight in modern times, but it's a different way of being, knowing, and doing than perhaps the market world lets us be. And I think that's both its appeal and part of its challenge, because we have to learn new ways of doing things. It's not just a matter of having Congress enact a new policy or new set of regs and, done, we finished that. It's really more of an ongoing process, especially one that is embedded in a place or specific circumstances. And then you therefore have a deep understanding or knowledge of that situation, as opposed to the world as this universal grid of fungible spots, and the uniqueness of that place or this community is not part of the conversation as well. So, there's a lot of fuzzy edges and frontier topics for this as well. And it's a matter, I think, of trying to, over time, clarify our sense of what the possibilities are, because we're embedded in a different paradigm to begin with. And how do we create workarounds, or how do we create duct tape solutions in the meantime? It's not as if there's going to be some big shiny overnight revolution that happens. It's going to be a process.
Great. So I'm hearing that, commoning and commons is really, it's based on a different ontology, a different foundational worldview. The process of creation is a different process. So it's not that we can make the UN think like a commons or act like a commons, right? Or that the federal government will somehow, become more common friendly in some way, but it's something more.
I would just say at the outset, I think that those larger systems have a natural inertia or resistance to something that will change their structural commitments and priorities. I see this as a way of creating an alternative that over time will kick them in the shins and force them to, the way Linux and open source software did to the proprietary software world, the way the local food and organic movement did to big ag. It was in some percentage way, a very small element of that larger universe, but its existence as a functional alternative was a moral indictment and a sign that there was another way of doing this that was kind of threatening to the big players. And I think that's the beginning of opening a new conversation, and more from a position of strength and having something to offer, as opposed to going hand in hand to politicians, many of whom are already bought off, to say, oh, please, sir, can I have some more and do this? And I think that a lot of the electoral system, not to give up on it, because I have great admiration for people who work trying to achieve good things through it, but I think it does have limited, the term I would use is affordances. Its capacities and structural ways have certain limits. And so that's one reason that I see the commons as sort of opening up a different arena, a different space for exploring solutions, which in time and the right circumstances can re-engage with conventional political systems and the political economy.
Great. You mentioned, the structural limitations of large institutions currently. So does that mean if I am interested in working in a more commons-based way or commoning, that are there structures to follow? Are there structures to commons, or is it just grow organically and through trial and error? Or
well, I think that's right now, after many years of exploring this, a lot of commoners are realizing that they're reaching a certain scale or size or potency, but they need certain types of finance, they need certain types of infrastructure, and certain legal recognition or sanction from the state. And so there's a struggle going on, especially in certain cities like Barcelona and Amsterdam and Seoul, Korea, where they realize they'd like to reimagine city government in some way, and they're experimenting and exploring how they might do this. And I think there's a certain difficulty or tension because the state and electoral politics has its own logic and ways of engaging with problems, its own ways of taking credit, centralizing control, one size fits all bureaucracy, versus a commons, which is far more situational, improvisational, bottom up. But, I heard recently this fantastic story about in Taiwan, they have a digital minister who has a lot of relationships with hackers. And to deal with the pandemic, he worked with them to create a quick app so that people could get identify where vaccines were available and where they're short, where there's plenty of them, so that the app could help them with that. Well, this is something that the state bureaucracy with, RFPs and the bureaucratic rules, it's very difficult to do. But there's many of these kind of bottom-up commenting projects, the way mutual aid networks in the wake of the pandemic mobilized quickly, instantly, and effectively in many cases. So I think the state needs to find new ways of working with these commons-based ways of working. And as I say, finance, infrastructure, and law will be part of that. But so I think for me, that's a way of imagining, okay, what type of innovation has to occur to unleash these different kinds of social energies. So that's how I see it.
And how about internally for a commons itself, whether it be a new commons or one that's up and running? Are there rules? Are there structures? Is it just what can be decided between any individual group of people that come together? What have you noticed?
Well,
your governance before.
Eleanor Ostrom famously had identified 8 very general patterns or general principles, she called them, design principles of commons, which I think are a very solid base to work on, even if she was working, I think, in a different mindset about the commons. In our book, Free, Fair, and Alive, by focusing on patterns, and some of you might know the work of Christopher Alexander and pattern languages, where he looked at why certain socially originated practices emerged in architecture and urban design, and developed a whole system of thought about patterns, about how these serve certain inner needs and functional needs and so forth. Well, the patterns for us are a way of looking at diverse types of phenomena of commons and identifying the regularities. So they're not rules in a strict sense, but they're more touchstones or guidance for it. And I think any group of commoners has to decide themselves, but we find that these patterns are instructive for pointing in the right direction. And having said that, I will say that I'm constantly surprised at different types of commons that I would not anticipate in one arena or another, in theater, in architecture, in humanitarian rescue and design through digital apps and things like that. And so I hate to get too prescriptive, because I think this is more, a lot of it is, you might say, under theorized, and as embodied human activity will probably always be under theorized, and maybe should be under theorized, because can you explain everything you do in your life, or why you love someone, or why you do something? And I think that if this is about an embodied human activity, as opposed to some grand universal theory. So that's one caution about how one gets into it.
Sure, great, thank you. Maybe I think it'd be helpful if could you point to some of those patterns that you recognize, because I think it'd be helpful for those on the call who are saying, wow, this sounds great, I'm interested in doing this. So what are some of those overall patterns that they could be looking for?
Sure. Well, as I said before, we, as a way to get a handle conceptually on it, we put it into 3 realms: social life, provisioning, and peer governance. But since governance is so, they're all interrelated, but they were sort of a way of getting a grasp on it. For peer governance, I'll just read some of the patterns that we identified that we saw in a variety of contexts. One of the first ones, of course, was bringing diversity into shared purpose. You can't presume that there's a shared purpose to begin with. There's often a diversity of motives for people joining a commons, and you have to do things that, through a lot of discussion and work, clarify that shared purpose. You need to develop certain trust and shared communication. So one pattern we saw was honoring transparency in a sphere of trust. So it's not just simple disclosure in a formalistic way. It's about doing so where you can share even embarrassing stuff or something went wrong, but you can do so knowing that the community will simply not have retribution on you for it, that there's a way to preserve relationships while sharing information. We talk about sharing knowledge generously, assuring consent in decision making. We found that a lot of commons, they rely on heterarchy. And by that we mean not the strict vertical hierarchies, but sometimes hierarchies with elements of flexible modular roles, open source style, where people are not prescriptively pigeonholed into one or another task role or job or social identity. So heterarchy can be valuable. And then we realize that commons don't have a strict boundary around them the way property law asserts it, but it's a semi-permeable membrane, as we called it, meaning like any living thing, you let the good stuff, the nutrients in, and you exclude the stuff that might be harmful to the community and keep it out, sort of like the blood-brain barrier. And so commons kind of are not strictly exclusive, but they have this breathing in and out and interactions with the outer world selectively in ways that benefit it. So those are just some of the patterns. I suppose another one, which is kind of important to me, is the idea of what we call relationalizing property. So it's not as if it's just mine or just yours or even collective property. The point is that people have a relational role to the property so that they have a commitment and engagement as a collective to it, as opposed to the standard property notions of exclusion being the only or primary function going on. So those are, some of the patterns of peer governance. We identified a total of 28, but we consider this a very dynamic and open process. And in fact, Silke and I realized that we wish we had had time to have developed a whole sphere dealing with the inner life, because I think that's an important part of this too. But that's for another day or another book. But I think that the inner life of commenting is something that deserves being probed more deeply.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm gonna, one final question, and then I'm going to pass it to my colleague Trey to offer some sense making and reflections on our discussion. So my final question is sort of, what is the energy of a commons? What keeps it going? What keeps people coming back and keeping the commons commoning?
Well, I mean, I should, without trying to sound too Panglossian, I think I should mention that in actual practice, many commons have patriarchy, have all sorts of parochial social pathology. So it's not as if this is a magic pixie dust that solves everything. You find community forests in India that are quite beset by the patriarchal village elders. And so forth. But having said that, I think the reason people stick with commenting, for one, in many cases, is survival and the meeting of basic needs. I think the social context and mutual support, the satisfactions that come with that, the flexibility in meeting needs, I think a lot of these things happen in a way that gives them some important emancipation from a market state system that doesn't really care, or that is too brittle, or focused on other people's concerns. So to the extent that a lot of commons have low overhead costs and are not beset by debt, they're more flexible in responding to situations. They're not as market dependent as a debtor would be, or a debtor business. So there's these kinds of freedoms that occur once you get out of debt servitude, or a friend, I forget, was it you or someone else who said that between being in debt or your phone apps, there's not a whole lot of space for the imagination in today's world. And I think that the Commons opens up a lot of spaces for imagination that wouldn't, if you were within a business trying to compete in a fierce market, maybe dominated by the rentier economy of big guys, there's not a whole lot of space for entertaining alternative approaches. So I think the way open source did, the way, organic agriculture and agroecology and permaculture have, there's space for freedom. And I think that that's a big appeal for a lot of commons, and the fact that it's not just a rhetorical gesture or ideology, it's something that meets real needs. So I think that's what keeps commons going.
Great, thank you so much, David. I'm going to pass it over to Trey, and then we'll have some time for further reflections.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Jeff. And again, thanks for everyone who has, invested their time in this. Want to share my screen, and before we jump into this, just want you to know what we've done is just taken this conversation and just landed it into a meta frame as a means to help land the conversation in a way that may be meaningful to you. It may be insightful. It may not serve you, but it's a way for us to be able to help organize some of the conversations consistent with how we see regeneration. And so with that, I'd be a quick share, thumbs up if everybody can see my screen. Great. So we took, this is nRhythm's framework, and it's really, we see in 5 categories: context, health, structures, work, and abundance. And it's really feels linear or process right here, but really we see it as a dynamic living system that allows us to get clear around certain aspects of how we see the world. And very similar to the way you've said, David, the desire is for us to get clear on what those boundaries are, those semi-permeable boundaries that we call context, understand what it looks like within that living system to create the conditions for health, design structures that would enable the health of that system, and then begin to do the work that we want to see happen together, and in essence, to create the abundance that we want to create in the system. So with that, we've tried to, in a very short period of time, to honor what you've talked about, David, and start to capture some of the things you've said across that in that framework. And so I'm just going to capture some of it. It is not complete. It is meant to be a conversation starter and actually provide an opportunity for people to ask deeper questions. So in the few minutes that we have, we'll capture or communicate what we have, but to know we would welcome any additions to what this is, because it's just a snapshot of a conversation. So when we get into context, it really is about shared purpose. And we began to become really clear, based on what you were saying, David, the importance that commoning isn't new, it's ancient. It's got a root in the past, that it's very context specific, and that it really is and continues to be a critique of this marketplace understanding, and even our whole idea of modernity. Commons as a vehicle for social and political transformation is what we saw starting to show up in the conversation, and that all of this is coming and being influenced by many different things, from the disillusionment of our political or local situations, but the desire to see real change. And that we recognize in being able to create that permeable boundary, that it requires a quality of life that we all want to maintain, one that's about inner life of commoning, could be relationalizing, which is what you called out, property, shared resource and self-organizing, a disposition, really trying to eliminate the disposition of people to make it an inclusive aspect of what we're doing, and that it's unique to place in community, and that there's freedom and shared wealth and the ability to have that shared purpose, and to recognize something you said at the very beginning when you were talking about your history, that culture precedes politics. So what does it look like to create conditions as a quality of life to be able to lean into that for that future? And space for imagination, space for freedom, and an opportunity for it to meet real needs. This requires, and I loved how you said, some rituals, some agreements, some behaviors that would need for us to manage the resource that we've come together to manage. And that requires everyday practices and honoring transparency in the spirit of trust and generosity. And then the flexibility to respond to different situations. Actually, I put later on in here, which I thought was great, you'll see when I get to it, is there's a need to have these duct tape solutions, recognizing that we are in process and that we need to honor that process that we're in. When we move into health, one of the things that we talk about is what's the energy of the system and how do we create the conditions for high energy within the system. Just like within a natural living system, access to the sun allows for us to create more energy. And so what does that look like? Flexibility of roles or diversity, as well as creating the conditions for mutual support and freedom. And then one of the things we really like to accentuate when we talk about health within the system is what things need to die that then create the conditions to give life to. And so commons as transaction of resources that gives life to it being relational or care wealth, the way you talked about it. The idea that what needs to die is worldviews that prevent you from understanding a different perspective versus this onto shift or learning new ways of being and doing. The idea that what needs to die is me as the individual and the only resource, that we're not isolated, that we're, to use your term, the nested I, and that there needs to be states, new ways of working within the commons, that we need to let die that it's an external problem versus a way that we could redesign or an internal challenge and new perceptions. What needs to die is this fixed language or noun language, and it allows us to move into an action-oriented language, or one that captures the essence of these local contexts. And then we just talked about, in terms of communication, siloing that shows up, that some of the things that really start to get in the way of that is barriers in our language. And what can we do to address that? And our shared understanding of our contexts. In the network connections, or what are, we see this as kind of like the soil life of the community, and recognizing here are all kinds of influences and things that have shared and leaned into informing this kind of work, from Eleanor Ostrom to Norman Lear to Andreas Weber, to this indigenous wisdom, to the idea that living systems are relational, resources that are informing this work in a really deep and meaningful way. So then when we get to this idea of the work or the structures, really it's about what are the structures that we think that will enable the health of everything we just talked about and continue to enable the context and the purpose that we laid out. And we recognized there were some things that we felt like began to show up as guiding principles for this. So identifying those guiding principles or patterns, recognizing, as we said earlier, living systems are relational, a different way of being, knowing, and doing, no single blueprint or definition, and that these structures really should be flexible and semi-permeable, allowing for evolution and change. So we captured a couple of these key structures: commons as social systems, activity and process. You called out governance in particular, social life, a platform for constructing alternatives, really getting outside of the box, the proverbial box, the way we talk about it. And then to recognize different types of commons. It's not linear or it's just a certain way you do it. It's really quite flexible with a lot of creativity and ingenuity from being able to see it within all kinds of different aspects of life, from finance or economics to how we design communities and infrastructure, to what it looks like when we look at it from a legal institutional perspective. But it really opens up this idea of imagination. And then just this continued thing that I mentioned earlier is it doesn't have to be pre-designed. We're in process. So this duct tape type solution allows for us to play with it, to continue to work it versus feel like it's static and not a living system. And then last, we just identified a few different things that we thought, based on what you had communicated, was some real barriers to what we call the abundance of the system that we think is potential that's unrealized, is that existing institutions don't have the trust that we need to have. And our ability to work at a cellular level and to free up people to be able to live into that. That states have logic and problem solving challenges, too much centralization, the desire, the need to unlearn our current modern approach, or recognizing that we should be moving to address these internal problems, and to just be truthful with ourselves that this is not like some magical pixie dust. The reality is we've got work to do. And often I say is there's a lot of shit that's got to get worked out. And this is our place to work that stuff out. And that some of the strategies that we continue working at that cellular level, different types of relationships, and continuing to create alternatives to the current system. So overall, again, this is no extrapolation from us. This is capturing the words that you brought out in David in the conversation. And so maybe just reflections from you or thoughts in reference to us capturing this for people to be able to think through and make useful in their idea of commenting.
Well, Trey, that's an amazing summary on the fly. So thank you for that. I mean, I'm amazed at that. I mean, looking at the chart, I see that abundance doesn't have many little post-its. And I would just add that I think we need to change our notion of abundance to not just raw material wealth, which we find to be quite sterile and not so nourishing, to something that's more, again, getting back to relationality, the denseness of relationships, the depth of those relationships, I think will be the abundance that we find while having our needs met. And I think that's sort of, so I'm glad you have that macro category of abundance, because I think that needs to be probed and unpacked more. But I think that's sort of the payoff for why people like the common, because there is an abundance, an inner abundance from it. But
Absolutely.
Beyond that, thank you for this opportunity just to share these ideas, and thank you for that beautiful summary.
Yeah, my pleasure. And actually, before I turn it over to Alex or Jeff for final thoughts, maybe a way for the group to come into the conversation is if you've got some things that you think would be wonderful to express in the abundance category in terms of how commoning could create that, please drop it into the chat, and we will drop those comments into the abundance category before we send this to everyone. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Jeff.
Yeah, I know we're coming up right on time, but I was looking in the chat. There are some folks that have some questions. If you have a little bit more time, David.
Yeah, sure.
So that'd be great. I'll just, from in the order that I saw them, I think Brian, you had some questions that came up for you during the interview.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks for hosting the space, and David, good to see you. As you know, I'm a fan.
Good to see you.
Yeah, I think my question has to do with power in the commons. And I think the thing that I was sitting with as you were sharing about the ontological shift is so many of the systems that we're stuck in, white supremacy, patriarchy, are reinforced in the people who currently have power, people who look like me and you. And so much of the shift and some of the commoning work that's done in practice tends to be from people who hold different identities for obvious reasons. And yet the academic framework still tends to come often out of a white or male frame with important exceptions from Eleanor Ostrom, et cetera. But I guess what I'm sitting with is in the context of the practice of a commons, where people have different social locations and different access to power, what is the social work that needs to happen to ensure that people can actually show up as their full selves without perpetuating some of these power dynamics that are out there in the world? Easy question, I know, so feel free.
I mean, I think that precisely needs to be earned from within a commons, and I think that needs to be cultivated. There's a lot of, well, I could go on about the toxic open source communities or the patriarchal community forest in India I mentioned, and others. I think that this, is a larger human struggle about power, but I think to the extent that power is decentralized and culturally spread among a community, there are built-in dynamics to restrain egoistic power dynamics. I think you see this in a lot of indigenous communities, not that we can simply teleport ourselves to that kind of a culture, but I think that when we've seen how Black Lives Matter have the move at the speed of trust approach, I think a lot of the ethics that a lot of these movements have developed are going to stand us in good stead to prevent the egoistic commandeering of movements or power in different contexts. And it's a matter of a commons cultivating that as an explicit ethic, so that it's not simply delegating to some elected or representative power figure. I mean, in terms of the societal differentials of power, I mean, that's obviously a far more complex thing than I can address here. I would simply say that I think commons, by changing the cultural temperature and offering real life examples, gives a point of access to doing something different and apart from the meeting of needs economically. So, I could be wrong, but that's my working hypothesis. And there's obviously a need for a lot of dialogue and intercommoning between commons.
Thank you, Brian, for your question. Maybe let's just plan on spending five extra minutes if we could, and if there's anyone else that has a question or reflection to David or in relation to the framework or just open.
Another thought occurs to your question, Brian, which is that I think, if anything, the self-decolonization that needs to happen among people, those with power, especially white males, is a big deal. And one could say that white males in particular have an important role to play in that. As translators, as for their own testimony for their own journey and so forth. So I think, getting out of essentialist identities into more humanistic relationships will help to dissolve some of those boundaries, which is not to minimize the plight we're in today, which is really quite profound. But I do think we need to open up some cultural spaces for this kind of more authentic human connection. But other questions?
Graham, you have a question, and David, there's some comments in the chat if you wish to.
Oh, okay.
Comment
Yeah,
on those.
I'll throw a question in. I'm curious, David, to know about what other approaches. I mean, my work is all about how do we change how we incorporate, and what I've generated together with a few other people, we're calling the Fair Shares Commons, because in many ways it includes Eleanor Ostrom's principles. And I'm curious about what else I might not know about ways of putting the commons into the protection that company law gives.
That company law, as in corporate law?
Yeah, corporate law. Corporate law is extremely powerful at protecting things And what other initiatives are there to harness that power in service of a commons?
Well, I think I would expand your question to a larger point of how can law be used to facilitate this? And I've recently come across this fascinating example in Minnesota of so-called solar commons, where they're using equity trust law as a vehicle for a community trust that then uses revenues from the solar panels to serve certain underserved communities and low-income people. But the point is that the equity trust law is proven to be an ingenious and flexible, versatile vehicle for doing that. Having said that, so I think there's a lot of need for legal experimentation to host and facilitate commoning within a hostile or indifferent market state system focused on property law and market exchange. Having said that, I've seen ingenious uses of things like limited liability partnership agreements for facilitating commoning. And I sort of like, that would sort of set me back on my heels because I sort of wouldn't have thought that that could be adapted. But for me, it becomes a fugue or conversation between the culture and the structures. And the structure is not enough, as we've seen with the co-op movement, much of which is peeled off to become quasi-corporate. Yet the culture is not enough either, because it could simply disappear tomorrow if somebody swoops in and buys the asset, or people say, oh, our real estate's suddenly worth more, let's liquidate and sell out. There goes the vehicle. So I think it's, for the short term especially, we need more standing off-the-shelf legal innovation. I think of people like Janelle Orsi at Sustainable Economies Law Center, who's doing fantastic work in that regard. But as I say, it's cultural too, and social practice in addition to the structures.
Thank you.
Great. Well, on behalf of everyone, thank you again so much, David, for taking this time to be with us and discuss these fascinating topics together. And thank you, everyone on the call, for joining and your questions. And Alex, I'll pass it back to you to wrap things up.
Yeah, thank you so much, David and Jeff and everyone for being here today. Just a quick note before we hop off, we're going to be circulating a recording of this in case you want to pass it on to any friends, coworkers, and if and a copy of the mural board as well, which mural is the tool that we use to capture the conversation. So we'll circulate a copy of that too for anyone who's interested, and feel free to pass it on. And just again, really appreciate learning more about the Commons, David, and thank you, Jeff, for moderating the discussion, and Trey for capturing, and thanks everyone.